All right. Good morning. The time is now 8:30 a.m. and I would like to call the June 23rd, 2023 meeting of the Energy Facility Siting Council to order. Mr. Secretary, please call the roll.
Marcy Grail,
Here.
Kent Howe,
Here.
Jordan Truitt,
Here.
Cindy Condon,
Here.
Harry Chalktoot,
Here.
Ann Beyer,
Here.
Richard Devlin.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. I have the following announcements. Please mute your phones, and if you are joining us by phone and receive a phone call, please hang up from this call and dial back in after finishing your other call. For those signed onto the webinar, please do not broadcast your webcam. For agenda item C, public comment period, there are two ways to let us know you are interested in providing comments to the council. For those using the WebEx, you will need to use the raise your hand feature. For those on the phone only, you will need to press *3, which will alert us that you want to speak. We will go over these options again during that agenda item. If you want to receive future email notifications of council meetings, project milestones, or rulemakings through our Click Dimensions program, you can do so by clicking on the link in the agenda or on the council webpage. Look for the green box on the right side of the page that says sign up for emails update. You are also welcome to access the online project mapping tool in any documents by visiting our website. Please note that the audio and video of this meeting is being recorded and may be posted to the council's website following the meeting. Energy Facility Siting Council meetings shall be conducted in a respectful and courteous manner where everyone is allowed to state their positions at the appropriate times consistent with council rules and procedures. Willful, accusatory, offensive, insulting, threatening, insolent, or slanderous comments which disrupt the council meeting are not acceptable. Pursuant to Oregon Administrative Rule 345-011-0080, any person who engages in unacceptable conduct which disrupts the meeting may be expelled. Our first agenda item is the approval of the June 1st, 2023 meeting minutes, which I will let the secretary address.
Madam Chair, that was going to be an agenda modification. Unfortunately, we were unable to get the draft June 1st meeting minutes done in time to get them out to you for your review. In fact, I just was able to complete my own review of them this morning. So they are not ready yet, but they will certainly be by the July meeting. So my apologies for that.
Thank you. Everyone is very busy, so we certainly understand. We appreciate that. So without that, then I will turn it over to you, Mr. Secretary.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. I have a few project updates. The first is the Lone Pine to Whetstone project. That's the 230 kV transmission line. That would be about 10 to 12 miles, extending from the city of Medford into Jackson County. On June 7th, the department held a public information meeting on the notice of intent in the city of Medford. I was not there, but my understanding is we had good participation, 20 to 30 people or so. The meeting materials for that public information meeting, including the video recording, are available on the project webpage in case you're interested. I know Councilmember Beyer participated virtually, so we appreciate that. Comments on the notice of intent are being accepted by the department through July 7th. All comments that are made will be publicly available via the department's comment portal. So many people are using that comment portal increasingly as their way of providing comments. So those are obviously available on there, but even ones that are submitted outside of the comment portal, we include in the comment portal. That makes it more readily accessible by the developer, and then everybody else can see everybody else's comments. So, and then just before I move on, I would just see if Councilmember Beyer had any thoughts or reflections from what she saw at the public information meeting.
Thanks, Todd. It's hard to tell how many people are participating when you're on the phone, but it was a good discussion with people raising issues that were of concern to them. Pacific Power tried to respond to those concerns, but nobody likes transmission lines, so very valuable. It's good to know that the comment portal is being used and that information is available to both the public and the applicant and us as a way to review. So thanks for the opportunity.
Yep, and thanks again for your taking the time out to participate in that. Next project update is the Boardman Hemingway transmission line request for Amendment 1. So Amendment 1 includes some site boundary additions in each of the 5 affected counties in Oregon and road location adjustments. The total adjustments would include approximately a little over 1,000 acres. So on June 14th, the department issued the public notice of a comment period. So we issued the draft proposed order, including a comment period. Comment period extends through July 18th. The council will hold public hearings in Baker City and Pendleton on the evenings of July 17th and 18th. And then all materials are available for review on the department's web page for that particular project. Moving on to compliance, there were several incidents. So for the Bigelow Canyon Wind Farm, this facility is a 450 megawatt wind facility in Sherman County. Portland General Electric is the certificate holder. On June 14th, PGE reported an incident of a broken blade bearing bolt found at the base of the turbine. The turbine was shut down to allow inspection of the hub and the blade bearing. The department is working with PGE to determine the adequacy of their evaluation and response. Since that just came in, it's still relatively early on. For inspections, there are several inspections that were conducted. On June 7th and 8th, the department conducted compliance audits and inspections at the 3 Shepherd's Flats facilities. So Shepherd's Flat North, South, and Central. These are the annual evaluations. And then on June 15th, the department conducted a compliance audit or inspection at the Columbia ethanol project. And I believe that one was an online one or a virtual one. So at this point, I do not have any findings or specific information to provide, but we will be having that come out in the next couple of weeks. And if there's anything of note that comes out of that, we'll provide that at the next update. And then just as a reminder, I was on a phone call with Councilmember Beyer recently, and she had again raised the interest in going out on site inspections with our compliance staff. And so I did have a conversation, Councilmember Beyer, with Dwayne Kilsdonk, our compliance officer. He was going to be looking at the near term, particularly the July meeting dates, and get you an email with those in case any of those work for you. And so just a reminder, if any council members are interested in participating in any of the inspections, we'd be happy to have you out there. I think there's a lot of value in seeing how these projects are being constructed or operated. The one caveat that I would put on there is, I use the different terminologies, site visit versus site inspection. And so if we, staff and council go look at a site, that's more of a site visit. It's a little kind of broader, a little more general. When Dwayne goes out there on site, he's doing a site inspection. He's going on and doing looking at very specific things. And so I absolutely believe it would be valuable for council members to go out there, just a recognition that it would be more of a shadowing of Dwayne during his regular duties. So there would be a little bit of a different sort of way of participating than we typically have during site visits. But again, if you're interested, we'll let you know. And Councilmember Beyer, I did had a conversation with Dwayne yesterday, so I know he was working on getting something to you. Next on my list are legislative updates. So as you're likely aware, if you've been tracking the news, that starting last week, the Senate and the House of the state legislature have had the quorums that they need to conduct their full duties. So there has been a pretty fast pace starting last week, late last week, and this week to get bills evaluated and passed prior to the constitutional end of the session, which is Sunday, June 25th. At this point, I do not know the status of the project or the bills that we have been tracking, but definitely at the next council meeting, we'll have a full account and evaluation of the legislative session for you. But at this point, I don't have any specific updates, just because it's, as I said, everything's sort of moving at a fast pace, and I just don't know the status right now. And last on my list are the next council meeting dates. As I had indicated, talking about the Boardman Hemingway Amendment number 1. We will be in Baker City on the evening of July 17th. That's a Monday. We will be in Pendleton on the evening of July 18th. Those are both evening public hearings, draft proposed order public hearings for Boardman Hemingway Amendment 1. And then July 19th, we will hold the regular council meeting. That'll be a Wednesday. In the morning, and however long that takes. But that's be our typical meeting date. We're still working on the agenda or the draft agenda in order to send that to Chair Grail for her review and approval. So we should have that out to you, Chair Grail, probably early next week.
Thank you.
So I know we've been in contact with all of you on the July meeting dates. If you have any updates, please get those to me or Nancy. Nancy needs to be getting the hotel rooms. I know she's actually already got some, but to confirm the hotel rooms, the numbers that we need, we just want to make sure that we have the number of in-person participants. So please make sure we are up to date on that. And with that, unless any council members have questions, I will conclude my secretary report.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Todd? I would just like to remind council members, just to ensure that I have the best connection, I am using my cell phone. So I've asked Secretary Cornett to keep an eye out for hands raised. And if you all have anything, just please feel free to speak up. I apologize, but I found this to be the best way to conduct this meeting.
Councilmember
Yes.
Cindy, Todd, if we want to go on a site visit / inspection to shadow Dwayne, should we tell you, call Dwayne directly? What's the best way to do that?
Either way, you can send, probably the best way to do it is to send an email to me and Dwayne. That way to make sure I'm tracking. He's pretty busy, he's got a lot going on, so I would say just to make sure that it doesn't get lost in the shuffle, better to connect both of us. And then, give us a date range that you're interested or available, and then we can put out the dates for you of when he's scheduled those inspections.
Thanks much.
And then many of them, would be going out there the evening before, spending the night in a hotel in order to get an early start. Certainly not a problem for us, but that's in terms of getting a hotel for any council members that are interested. But because of the location of the facilities, unless it's in relatively close proximity to where you live, it would likely also require you spending a night in a hotel in order to meet those timelines of getting up early and getting out and doing a full day inspection.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks. So our next agenda item is the application process review, phase 1 rulemaking. This is an action item. We have Chris Clark, the senior siting analyst, prepared to present. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Chair Grail, council members. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Well, as you mentioned, my name is Christopher Clark. I'm a senior siting analyst, and I'm filling in as backup rules coordinator for Tom Jackman, who's out of the office today. I'm going to be presenting staff's recommendation to initiate formal rulemaking proceedings to adopt amendments to the rules for the application process review. If I can get the next slide. Great. So you last saw this rulemaking at your March meeting. The draft rules are very similar. And to give an overview of what they would do, these draft rules are intended to improve internal consistency of the rulemaking, make some clarifications to the process, and make a few changes to simplify some of the procedures. One of the big changes is to unify the process throughout each stage of the rulemaking process. So each subset of rules, so the subset of rules for the notice of intent, the project order, and the preliminary application all follow the same structure. The rules aren't identical, of course, between those subsections, but they have been amended to be more similar. Next slide, please. So one example of this is in the rules for the public notice of intent. There is a public notice rule in for the notice of intent, but there wasn't a corresponding rule for the preliminary application or the complete application stages. So the draft proposed rules that are before you today would adopt new rules, adopting basically similar rules. And mainly that's accomplished by moving existing provisions to these new rules. If you could get the next slide, please. Oh, yeah, and so this shows that there. You do have a draft notice of proposed rulemaking in your packet. That does have the updated rule numbers for the new rules that you would be adopting. But as I just mentioned, there would now be a public notice of notice intent rule, which existed in 110, a new public notice of preliminary application rule, and a new public notice of complete application rule. Okay, next slide, please. The second big set of changes are changes just to improve the clarity and consistency of the rules. A lot of that are minor editorial changes, some correction of scrivener's errors or typographical errors, and then where rules have been combined or restructured, updating those references to just make sure that the new rules are consistent with each other throughout. Next slide, please. Okay, it's shown on this slide. There's just been some changes for consistency made throughout. For example, where there's informational meetings, making sure that the notice of the informational meeting states the date, time, location, and purpose. Even though these two sections of rules provided similar provisions, they didn't have quite the same requirements associated with them. So these rules would just make that a little more consistent. Next rule, please. Okay, so since you last heard of this rulemaking, there has been one RAC meeting, and that was held on April 27th, 2023. The RAC was attended by a few agency staff, some of the investor-owned utilities, and then representatives of the renewable energy industry, including Renewable Northwest and OSEA. There were also a few members of the public and members of special interest groups or conservation interest groups in attendance. After the meeting, staff gave an opportunity for RAC members to provide written comments, and there were 3 responses on those. The first response was from Jim Kreider. Mr. Kreider proposed several reorganizational changes to the rules. Those included moving rules within divisions 1, 11, 24, and 27. He proposed merging division 25 and 27, and then proposed renaming divisions 15 and 27. There's more details about his comments in the staff report, and then I believe an exact copy of his comments are attached as well. Staff is not recommending that council make these changes at this time. In particular, the changes that are outside of divisions 15, 20, and 22 are really outside of the scope of what the current rules intend to achieve. and the changes to the proposed renaming changes to Division 15 aren't necessarily necessary because those already clarify what is in those rules. I also wanted to point out that the proposed merging of Division 25 and 27, those divisions had been a single division at one point in time, and the council actually separated them in 2017.
Christopher, this is Marcy. So I just encourage council along the way. Don't forget to ask questions or make comments if that's okay that we do it along the way. I just want to be clear that it was my understanding, this was my words, not anybody else's, like de minimis cleanup, that we were trying to be clear, not make an overall change. That's what you presented to the RAC, correct?
Chair Grail, yes, that is correct. I would say that the changes in the draft rules, as far as I'm aware, are 98% non-substantive. They're just cleanup. They're moving things around, improving wording. There are two changes that could be considered substantive, but they really are intended just to simplify the process. They don't establish new requirements for applicants. One of those is a change to the process for appointing special advisory groups. There wasn't a rule for that before. These rules would adopt a rule doing that. And also the rule would delegate the authority to designate special advisory groups from the council to the department. So that would save us the step of having to come to you and get those designations at a council meeting. As you know, that's not a discretionary choice. Statute says you have to do it. So this would just say the department can do it. The other change is it involves the distribution of the notice of intent and the preliminary application. Right now, the way the rules are structured, it says that the department will create a distribution list and they'll run it by the applicant, and then we'll distribute all the application materials to the people on that list on a specified date, and then the applicant would be mailing all the application materials as well. Because of advances in electronic communication and because we do almost all of our process paperless now, that whole process just isn't necessary. So we are proposing to cut that from the rules. But those are the two substantive changes.
And I apologize if I jumped ahead of you. In my mind, from when you commented on Mr. Kreider's comments, I wanted to make sure that I didn't get off track from the intent. So thank you for that clarification.
Can I jump in, Madam Chair, if I may?
Yes, please.
So the other thing to kind of think about is, if we were just doing a general cleanup of the rules, I think we agreed probably with a lot of the comments that Mr. Kreider made. But it's not just an overall general cleanup of the rules. If it was, we would be doing a lot more work than we're proposing here. Please remember that this is just phase one of 3 phases of rulemaking with an intended sort of outcome. It's really just setting the stage up for phase 2 and then phase 3. So while it is a cleanup of the divisions, that Chris is talking about today, it is sort of narrow in its scope to really set up the phase 2 and the phase 3, which are more trying to get the application requirements and the standards better connected, and these really help that by pulling some of the information out of the Division 21, the application requirements, Division 22, the standards, in order to then set that up for the next phase. So again, not to say that Mr. Kreider's comments weren't good, and we probably agreed with a lot of Mr. Kreider's comments, just not in the context of this particular rulemaking.
Thank you for that.
Right. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Secretary Cornett. And to echo what Chair Grill just said, if any of the council members do have a question or would like to comment on any of these rules, please feel free to interrupt me. My participant pane is on a different screen right now, so I'm not looking directly at you all. So just speak up and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Chair Grail, this is Kent.
Yes, Vice Chair Howe.
I think this might be the appropriate time for a couple of comments I have as it relates to a recent application that we dealt with that a number of us land use wonks were getting into the weeds on a Goal 3 exception, and I used some probably poor language in when we were in the hearing process and said, you know, this needs to be buttoned up. And my comment there was to the applicant and not to staff. And this phase 1, the purpose is to separate and to make it easier for an applicant or a member of the public to understand what the applicant must do compared to what the staff must do through the citing process. And so I felt kind of bad that it seemed like the staff really went back to work to the drawing board and to get it to where it was something that the council agreed upon, met the test. And I'm just wondering, that I thought should have been work that the applicant did. And maybe this isn't the place for that distinction to be made when the applicant's got to go back and do some additional work to make it clear that they're meeting the requirements of the rule or not. So that's my question, kind of. This phase 1 may not be the place for that, but since this is the one that's kind of, I thought was to understand what the applicant must do compared to what staff must do, I wanted to raise this as just a discussion point. Any comments?
So
Do people know what I'm referring to as far as when we really were needing more from the applicant? I'm not sure the applicant provided a lot more. The staff worked it around to get it to where it was acceptable to the council, but that wasn't my intent. I wanted the applicant to do a better job of providing the information clearly to us.
Chris, I can respond to that. So yeah, thank you, Vice Chair Howe. I don't think we were confused by your comments. So if there was any concern that you had that we were confused, we were not. So we were clear about that. But in terms of how that applies in this rulemaking, it doesn't really apply in this specific rulemaking.
Okay.
But getting into, and it goes back to exactly what I was saying, is this rulemaking sets up phase 2 and phase 2 sets up phase 3. And really phase 3 is going to be a set of rulemakings looking at the specific standards and the specific application requirements. And so your comment right now really, you know, I think has applicability towards phase 3 when we get into, say, the land use standard. And so that will be a question where we look at the land use standard and say, you know, based upon statute, obviously, you know, are there any changes that we should make to the standard itself? And then looking at the standard, what are the directions and clarity, if any, can we make to the application requirements? So that really, what you're talking about, you know, will come out later on in phase 3 when we open up the land use standard. I don't know the answer to the question if we're going to do anything, but that's where we'll evaluate that to say, again, can we make any changes to the standard? And then again, you know, how much more clarity can we put into, you know, into the application requirements, which then feed into that standard. So we will get to that question, but just in phase 3.
Okay, thank you. That's what I wanted. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing an opportunity at phase 1 to deal with this. And it sounds like just hold my horses and wait till phase 3.
But I appreciate it. And yeah, we were, like I said, we were clear on your comments, or at least staff was.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you,
Grail?
Councilmember Howe.
Yes, I hear Councilmember Condon, I think, or is that Councilmember Byer?
Buyer.
This is Councilmember Byer, and just, I really appreciate the effort to clearly outline the responsibilities of the applicant and the department. And I think Vice Chair Howe's comment that we carry that through as we look at the standards is going to be really important. I think it's makes for a cleaner process for the applicant, provides some ease for the department, and also helps the public better understand who is responsible for doing what. So I think we're setting a good outline for moving forward with any rulemaking. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Okay, Chris, I think it's back to you.
Thank you, Chair Grail. And I will just add, as a the former rules coordinator and someone who still thinks about the rules a lot, to the extent that the council can think of what sorts of evidence that you want to see when we get to those other phases of this rulemaking. The rules can certainly be amended to reflect findings of adequacy for evidence and findings that set the standard for the applicant's burden of proof, as well as standards for what substantively needs to be happening during the design, construction, and operation of facilities. But that's all I'll say on this. I'm sure Tom will also be very interested in this conversation, so we'll make sure he's aware. And if you can move to the next slide. Great. So we did get a comment letter from Renewable Northwest. There had been an early recommendation to use tables to summarize some of the rule requirements, particularly the noticing requirements. The staff is recommending that we publish these tables on the website, but the recommendation to include them in the rules themselves is not moving forward, in part because of some of the Secretary of State's requirements about rule structure and how you can display tables in the new electronic rules system. Renewable Northwest recommended adding internal references about where language has been moved to. So, giving a formally at OER 345 kind of reference. Staff, I think, agrees that could be helpful in the short term, but in the long term, it really isn't necessary as people get used to the new structure of the rules. So we're not recommending adopting that change, but Tom has prepared a crosswalk document, I believe similar or the one that's attached to your staff report, and we'll post that on the website as separate guidance. Renewable Northwest recommended clarifying whether applicants were required to attend informational meetings on a complete application. Staff did make a change clarifying that is the case, that applicants are required to attend all informational meetings. And then the Renewable Northwest also sought clarification on where the new requirement to provide a public notice to the land managing agency that administers a protected area appeared in the rules. Staff did provide that clarification in the staff report, I believe. And just to clarify, that is another substantive change, but that is one that council had already committed to making when we completed the protected areas rulemaking last year. Okay, and next slide, please. Great. And then the last comment we got was from the Oregon Solar Plus Storage Industries Association, or OSEA. Their comments were generally positive, although they did raise some concerns with the changes I described before about coordinating with the applicant on the distribution list for um, for the notice of intent and the preliminary application. I already talked about that a little bit, so unless there's other questions, I can move on. Not seeing any. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so since you last saw the draft proposed rules, there's been just a few small changes. One of those is that we are not recommending to renumber the contested case rules right now. The council will be looking, well, staff will be bringing the contested case rulemaking that's already on your schedule to you in the near future, and we just thought it would be appropriate to address those rules in that rulemaking, particularly since some of the current rules may be amended or removed. So just to prevent a duplication of effort there, we are proposing to leave those where they are for now. The second change is the removal of the notice chart suggestion, as I just stated, and then some updates to references to the new rule for the appointment of special advisory groups. As I kind of discussed, we are also proposing to remove the distribution list requirement in general. The rule already states that the distribution has to include the reviewing agencies for the department, and the rule for reviewing agencies says that the council or that the department has the discretion to adopt additional reviewing agencies in addition to the mandatory reviewing agencies that are already required. So this distribution list requirement was kind of a no longer necessary and a little redundant. Oh, sorry. Next slide, please. And this is what I just talked about. So one more slide. Thank you. Great. And then some minor changes as well to reference errors and making titles a little more plain language friendly. So yeah, you can see these on the slide here. I won't read them. Next slide, please. And then again, the changes shown on this slide are primarily just editorial changes to rules. The new rule 198, which is about information in meetings on a complete application. Some text changes to Division 20, Rule 6 to just correct numbering, and also removing a section that referred to an applicant requirement in Division 15 that it already appears in Division 21. Okay, before I move on, I just wanted to double check and make sure there are no questions on the proposed rules. I can pull them up, but this is the end of my presentation on what is actually being proposed today.
Does anyone have any questions for Chris?
Chair Grail, Cindy Condon.
Yes.
And
Councilmember
actually,
Condon.
not a question, but I did want to comment before we take any action. Is I really appreciated Tom and others' work with respect to the presentation of the material for review by the council and the comments, being able to track the comments in the document itself. So especially electronically, not having to refer back to different pages. Just a comment that I thought that was quite helpful for review. So thank you to staff.
Thank you for that comment. Any others?
Madam Chair, this is Todd Cornett for the record. Just one, not really a comment, just to make sure that you're all tracking. One of the things we're requesting that, here that you allow us to formally initiate the rulemaking. Normally, we would then, we would file with Secretary of State and do a public notice, and then we hold a rulemaking hearing. It's not required, but our practice for some time has been to hold most rulemaking hearings in front of council at a regular council meeting. This is one of the rare circumstances where we're actually requesting to not have that happen. That would allow us a little more flexibility to be able to turn around the rulemaking hearing a little more quickly. Because this is really non-substantive or primarily non-substantive, that's the reason why we're requesting that the hearing would not be in front of council. We will certainly let council members know when that would be, and you can log in and watch that. We would record that, put that on the website as well, or you could watch it afterward. But I just want to make sure that you're tracking that request. Again, it's our practice that hearings occur in front of council. That's not going to change. The vast majority of rulemaking hearings moving forward will still be in front of council. This is just one of those rare instances based upon the nature of this rulemaking where we're requesting a variation of that practice.
Thank you for that clarification and explanation. I would ask council members if they have any comments to what Secretary Cornett has stated.
Yeah, and Madam Chair, if I may, the notice of proposed rulemaking in your council packet, and if I could get the next slide, I'll just move on to that. It would schedule the public hearing for 10 a.m. on July 26th, and that would be a virtual hearing. And then there would be the deadline for public comments would be August 18th.
Yeah, and just one of the difficulties of for us, of the Secretary of State's process and the fact that the council, meets monthly and, sometimes, when we're scheduling these rulemaking hearings, we're not sure if we're going to have a regular council meeting based upon the dates that we've scheduled. So it creates some practical scheduling difficulties, not that we can't overcome, but as we file this with the Secretary of State, we have to have the time and date of the rulemaking hearing set in there already. That's why we need to have that kind of figured out. We can't figure it out at a later time. We have to figure it out now.
Chair Grail?
Yes, Councilmember Byer.
So just a couple comments. One, I'm comfortable moving this forward without a hearing before FSEC. I would just want to make sure that the public understands why we're doing this and that it is kind of an exception to general practice. And then just a question, if all of a sudden staff got a multitude of comments on the rulemaking, would there be the opportunity to then send it to the council? Does that make sense?
I understand the question. I'll ask Secretary Cornett or Patrick or Chris to respond, please.
I believe that'll be a Chris question.
Yeah, so in the Administrative Procedures Act, the council may extend the deadline for public comments. You have to extend it for everyone. So that would be an extension for both written and oral comments. If you did schedule a new hearing, that is certainly an option that the council has. The council can add additional hearings if you want. I believe we would be required to re-notice that hearing. So we would just send out a new notice to the people on our mailing list and let them know when that new hearing is.
Thank you for that. Yes.
Thank you, Chris. That answered my question, and it's very, very unlikely in this situation, but just knowing that if there were a lot of comment, we could revisit the rulemaking. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I would like to reiterate what Councilmember Byer said, that I think it's important for the public and other stakeholders to understand why we would make this exception, and that in no way are we shirking our responsibilities or trying to delegate them elsewhere. Other comments, questions?
As a member of the RAC, I'm wondering if I might have an opportunity
yeah,
to
Jim,
speak
Jim,
here, or
Jim,
if I have to
I
wait
think
until
Mr.
the public
Kreider.
comment area.
Jim,
Mr.
this
Kreider.
yeah, this is not a public comment opportunity. So please, anybody who's not a council member or staff, please refrain. There will be an opportunity for public comment during the regular public comment period.
Thank you. Any questions, comments from council members? Yeah, I don't hear any. If Todd doesn't see any, then Chris will ask you to proceed, please.
Thank you, Chair Grail. Yep, so to just conclude my presentation, staff's recommendation is that council approve the draft proposed rules as presented in the draft notice of proposed rulemaking, and authorize staff to issue that notice of proposed rulemaking. And I guess just so you know the logistics, if you do approve our recommendation as shown as option 1 on this slide, I will file with the Secretary of State today, and then Tom will be doing the noticing when he gets back into the office next week.
Thank you. Council members, it's our turn.
Chair Grail.
Yes, Vice Chair Howe.
I move that the council authorize the initiation of the application process review phase 1 rulemaking as presented and recommended by staff.
Thank you, sir. I heard a second from Councilmember Devlin.
Correct.
Thank you, sir. Any other comments, questions? Hearing none, Mr. Secretary, please call the roll.
Kent Howe,
Yes.
Ann Byer,
Yes.
Richard Devlin,
Yes.
Jordan Truitt,
Yes.
Perry Chalktoot,
Yes.
Cindy Condon,
Yes.
Marcy Grail.
Yes.
Motion carries, Madam Chair.
Thank you, everyone. Chris, thanks for stepping in and helping out on this agenda item. We are always happy to hear from you.
Thank you, Chair Grail.
Our next agenda item is the public comment period. This is time reserved for the public to address the council regarding any item within council jurisdiction that is not otherwise closed for comment. Applications for site certificates which are closed for comment include the Nolan Hills Wind Power Project. I'm going to turn this item over to Nancy for assistance and facilitating now. Nancy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let's go ahead and open up Jim Kreider's microphone so he has a comment. Mr. Kreider, you are ready to speak.
Okay, thank you all. I just wanted to comment on the last item you all discussed. As a member of the RAC, I was frankly a little surprised at the process. I've participated in several rulemakings in different state agencies. And during this RAC, we had a training, we had an opportunity to comment. There was no discussion afterwards on our comments. And the first I saw of staff's recommendation was in the minutes to this meeting that you're having now. And I feel frustrated because the members that took the time to present information were not allowed to have a dialogue with staff about what they wrote, what it meant, and how it fit into the overall process. The purpose was to ensure that procedural rules are internally consistent and flow logically. I took the time to look at your various chapters and thought about how a person entering your arena logically look at the rules or the sections or the chapters. I rearranged them in an order that seemed to make more sense. However, there was no opportunity for a discussion. Staff just took what they wanted to do and did it. I tried to talk to you all beforehand, but Your rules preclude that, which I think is a problem additionally, but we'll get to that in another story. But the whole thing that you've forgotten about in this process is you're talking about the applicant and the staff. No mention of the public understanding the rules and the intersection for them to be involved. You totally lost that point. You also have other parts in the process, requests for additional information, and the SAG comments. That's a part of the process where the public can gain knowledge and information about the thinking of staff and how they are interpreting rules. So the public should have some way to interject into this process, because we generally have sitting around your table are the applicants, those of the industry, and the regulators. The public doesn't have the opportunity to be at the table because they work when you guys do your work. And how can we have a fair process where the public can be involved when they don't have a clear seat at the table? And as you redo your rules, you're not making a clear seat for them at the table. So I think I asked you to take a look at how I reorganize stuff. It's not the greatest, but it wasn't discussed. The Renewables Northwest, not discussed. So informal rulemaking has more discussion amongst the participants than a RAC. I joined a RAC because I thought my voice might be a little louder, but I find in a RAC, my voice is less. So I really encourage you to look at your public participation process and how you structure it. Because if you're asking people to go through a RAC on stages 2 and 3, that's going to be a heavy lift. And why would I want to participate if you're not even going to give me a chance, or staff is not going to give me a chance to explain what I wrote, why I wrote it, and how it maybe fits into the bigger picture? So I don't think your process is fair. I don't want to call it a sham, because it is an important process and you're trying. And I am offering these things as a friend, not as an antagonist or an enemy, but I want to see the public more involved in the process. And I'm a member of the Environmental Justice Council. And a part of our work is looking to make sure that environmental justice considerations are embedded in agencies' decision-making processes. The way this is set up, it's not happening. And I really think we can do a better job. And I say we because I feel I'm a part of this process. I'm sure some of you might feel that from the Stop B2H issues that we were in opposition. But man, I have learned so much about how the public responds to and reacts to your rules and your process. And I would like to make it better for everybody. There you go. Those are my comments. I thank you very much. I know you don't speak to us or take questions, so I thank you for letting me babble.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Kreider. Nancy, are there other members of the public wishing to speak?
Yes.
Excuse me. Yes, next I have Irene Gilbert. Irene, I'm going to unmute your mic and you are ready to speak.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. I know you can't see me. I have a computer problem. My video isn't working, but I would just kind of like to add my support to Mr. Kreider's comments. I think that anytime actions are removed from a public process before the council, it fails to provide the transparency that the public really has requested and continues to request. So that would be my first comment. And many of you are no doubt aware that I spent many years, this is a different topic, I spent many years as an OSHA trainer, training about how to have effective programs and in multiple areas like flagging, ladder safety, confined spaces, all kinds of things. Anyway, it's about effective management programs or monitoring programs, which you folks do a lot of that kind of mitigation and monitoring programs. And what I know to be so is that to be effective, any program has to have requirements that don't lend themselves to interpretation, that they show what has to be done, when, and how it's to be communicated to employees, and how it will be documented for making sure that the procedures are followed. Your monitoring and mitigation plans are really the only place where the developer will be shown to be complying with the requirements of the site certificate. The only thing that can be determined without mitigation plans is your decision that the developer is able to meet your standards, not that they will meet your standards. So effective programs should not be including comments or statements like if practical, time permitted, as approved by. So looking at recent newspaper articles, what you will see is that one of the developers of the Boardman to Hemingway transmission line is Pacific Corp. And they have had, as you know, many, many problems recently. They've been found liable for a bunch of fires. And I would venture to say that part of the reason that they're going to be paying billions of dollars for the consequences is the fact that they did not have either an effective program that was very specific about what was expected of them. That program was not communicated. People were not required to follow it if it did exist. And as a result, shortcutting on the management requirements is ending up costing them billions of dollars that actually potentially could result in bankruptcy for them. So just to take one example, I'm reacting to the fact that ODO is being responsible for the final mitigation plans, which in my mind is the very most important part of a site certificate, is what those mitigation and monitoring plans are going to include. And I just wanted to read to you a few statements. I only have looked thoroughly at one plan so far, and that is the draft weed management plan or monitoring plan that Idaho Power has proposed and given to ODO. As of today, it's the only plan that I know has been presented, and it hasn't gone to the counties yet. But the plan includes such statements as they will, I'm going to read from it here. They will not be required to control or eradicate weeds that were present when they took control of the land, weeds outside the right-of-way, weeds occurring that were not a result of their specific actions, which created surface disturbing areas, meaning they're only going to be controlling weeds where they have torn up the habitat. Weeds, and there's no requirement to assure noxious weeds do not create and disperse seeds. So I know that I've presented and you've seen that the statutes require some of these things to be done for owners or occupiers of land. And one thing that it is stated in both in the plan and to you guys is that that the Idaho Power is responsible for assuring weeds are identified and controlled. It says in all by as controlled as stated in federal, state, and county and other local regulations. So the plan says that they have to comply with these, and yet the mitigation plan is only meeting quote unquote FSAC requirements and allows for all these exceptions, including being able to have ODO state that they have controlled weeds in an area, so they no longer have to monitor or control weeds at all for the life of the project. Now, Idaho Power says, well, it falls back on the citizens then to go to the county court and get an order and have the courts require them to do all of these additional weeds that your plan doesn't require them to manage. That's not really the way it works. And I looked at the monitoring and mitigation of weeds for Morrill County, their plan, and the bottom line is these county plans say not that the landowner has to take these actions, it turns it over to their weed program. So if Idaho Power is not managing and controlling all of the weeds on their site the way the state statute says they have to, then the counties are going to be responsible for it. It says the county weed inspector will go to the county court. They will issue a notice to the landowner or the occupier that they have to control these weeds. It puts total responsibility for that. The only thing the landowner does is contact the weed supervisor and say, we've got a problem. The weed supervisor does all of the work for this. So if Idaho Power is putting in a transmission line, and as a result of that transmission line cutting through areas where there isn't currently a road or an opening, weeds are being brought into that area. And that means that under your rules, it says weeds that are brought into the area have to be as a result of their actions that disturb the habitat. Well, the action of putting in a transmission line where one doesn't currently exist provides all kinds of opportunities for weeds to come in that Idaho Power can say, this wasn't my responsibility because trespassers brought these weeds in, or they blew in on the wind, or animals walking through this transmission line brought them in. And all of those noxious weeds end up being paid for by the counties, and the rules have all kinds, depending on the county, there are all kinds of different requirements about how it happens, but they all fall back on the counties to take care of these weeds and to meet the state requirements. So one of the things that the rules say is that other federal and state agencies are going to support the counties and in managing these noxious weeds. I have a hard time figuring out how the monitoring and mitigation plan that's being proposed meets that standard of supporting the management of noxious weeds when it doesn't include such critical pieces as they won't allow seeds, weeds, noxious weeds to go to seed. Well, it's not in the plan. And the reason I'm going through this on this just one management plan is the council has, by their decision, said that ODO is going to be able to approve these plans outside of the oversight of the FSAC. They're going to be able to make decisions about what is an adequate plan outside having any opportunity for the public at large to comment on the plans. And just the comments that I've made, I would think would make you wonder whether or not the outcome of these mitigation plans is really going to accomplish what it's supposed to, which is making sure that the developer is responsible for the negative impacts that putting in a transmission line has created, or whether or not the public and the counties are going to be the ones that are going to suffer from this. Is this process really going to get the outcome you want? Is FSAC going to ask the questions or bring up the issues or the public? None of us have an opportunity to actually read these plans and say, wait a minute here, limiting this is developers' responsibility for weeds to only ones that aren't currently present, when they have this big long list of weeds that are currently present, that the state statute says, if you're the owner or occupier of this land, you have to control all noxious weeds. Is it going to be okay to say that after 3 years, if ODO says that the weeds are controlled, the developer has no responsibility for the future as far as managing or controlling noxious weeds? These give the developer such a limited area of control or responsibility that it all falls back on landowners and the counties and the taxpayers to do what supposedly developers of this project are supposed to be responsible for. And all this, I know I've gone on and on about details that you probably aren't concerned with, but the ask that I have is, can't you request that Odo bring these plans before council to have you folks at least look at whether or not the plan that they're proposing accepting meets the kinds of requirements, or what the consequences are as far as the costs to citizens and resources of this state, that may not be determined or identified or addressed in whatever Odo is willing to accept. You know, you've received all kinds of input about things like Odo supported every single request that Idaho Power made to exclude contested cases, and they supported every single request to throw out cases because of summary determination in the contested case process. So now you're suggesting that the same company or the same group that recommended every single contested case be denied is going to be the group that's responsible for deciding whether or not Idaho Power is doing an adequate job or going to be held accountable for addressing the consequences of their actions. And this mitigation plan is where that is defined, and it's where accountability is established, and it's where what the real actions are that are going to meet the standard look like. So anyway, I guess my request is that you folks ask to at least have a review in a council meeting of these mitigation plans and what the criteria are, and provide the public at least an opportunity to make a public comment about concerns with whatever the details are of these plans. The details are everything. So anyway, that's my comment for today. I know I'm not as organized as I would like to be, but this issue is unbelievably important. And so it's probably the most important thing that you do as a group. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments, Ms. Gilbert. Nancy, is there anyone else?
Sorry, Madam
Yeah.
Chair, if I could, just to provide some clarification, I believe Ms. Gilbert's comments were related to the site certificate, which is approved, and the conditions associated with that. Should they have been any way connected to the amendment that currently has an open comment period, I just wanted to clarify that this wouldn't constitute a comment on the record of the draft proposed order for Amendment 1. So that would either need to be submitted in writing or during oral comment during the DPO hearings that we talked about before. So I just wanted to clarify, and I don't believe that she was making comments on the draft proposed order for Amendment 1, but to the extent that she might have, I just wanted to clarify that needs to be done in a different format.
And I was not commenting on the amendment. I was commenting on the site certificate and the many mitigation plans that are right now being drafted.
Yeah, thank you.
Madam Chair, we have Alex Joe has his hand raised and would like to make a comment. Alex, you are unmuted and ready to speak.
Thank you. I'm a California resident and a landowner in Christmas Valley. So I'm interested in what you do, and I have attended online and also in Christmas Valley, as Mr. Cornett hosted a meeting once before there regarding the Obsidian and the Fort Rock solar project. And I'm just trying to get back into the swing of things, so I decided to try to latch on to this meeting and also look at future FSEC meetings that will help me to make some determinations about my own plans with the property there and the solar aspects that might be available. I don't have the expertise right now to speak to Mr. Kreider or Ms. Gilbert's extensive comments, but I appreciate the fact that they bring those to the table because it's helpful to have some background. And I'd only say that I thought that our meetings that I have attended in the past have been well organized and did have a substantial amount of public comment to inform and to raise the appropriate questions needed to deal with the particular issue at hand. So I just want to thank you for making this WebEx available for us, me as a landowner, with solar plans in that area that's growing right now with a lot of potential. So with those comments, I just close the window and say thank you for allowing me to have a moment to introduce myself. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Joe.
You're welcome.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes, Secretary Cornett.
I just wanted to clarify, and thank you for the comments as well. I just wanted to clarify that just so you're tracking, I don't know if you're signed on to receive email notices. If you are, great, you will receive notices of, council meeting and then certainly the Obsidian project. If you're not, that's available on our website. You can sign up to receive notices. But just to give you the heads up, we are at least currently thinking that we will be in Christmas Valley on the evening of August 24th for a draft proposed order hearing on the Obsidian project for Amendment 1. That's not guaranteed yet. We're still working on the draft proposed order for that. But that's our current plan. So, and I know you're a resident of California, so I just want to give you a heads up in case you're interested in that project and seeing where that's going. We will be having a webinar for that as well, so you could certainly attend remotely. But since the last time you did show up in person, we would also be having an in-person meeting in Christmas Valley, again, likely on the 24th. Just wanted to give you a little bit of advance warning on that.
Thank you for that. Nancy, is there anyone else wishing to speak?
Madam Chair, I do not see anyone with their hand raised, but let me go ahead and just review how to raise your hand. So as a webinar participant, in the bottom right hand of the main window is a set of icons. Click on the participants. In the bottom of that window is a hand icon. Click on that hand and it will raise your hand. If you click it again, that will lower your hand. If you are participating by phone, press *3 on your telephone keypad to raise your hand and press *3 again to lower your hand.
Thank you for that. We're going to take a last call for public comments, please. Well, hearing or seeing none, we will close the public comment period at 9:44. The public comment period is now closed. Thank you. We now have on the agenda time for a quick break. I would suggest that we take a break and reconvene at 10 a.m. if everyone is agreeable to that.
That sounds good to me. This is Kent.
Thank you, Vice Chair Howell. Since he agreed, we are going to take a break until 10 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Now 10 a.m. and I'd like to reconvene the Oregon Energy Facility Siting Council meeting. Our next agenda item is, I should stop myself. Secretary Cornett, do you see that all the council members have returned?
Let me check. Yes, Chair Grail, I believe everybody's back.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, everyone. I dove right in without thinking first. Again, the time is 10 a.m. and we are now going to discuss the Goal 3 exceptions overview. This is an information item. We have Patrick Rowe, Oregon Department of Justice Senior Assistant Attorney General and Counsel to FSEC, ready to present. Good morning, Patrick.
Good morning, Chair Grail and Council. Oh, I'm sorry that we skipped over that first slide. Yeah, I love that slide because apparently I've been promoted to the military and I've immediately become a general. So anyhow, that's my smile for the morning. I'm a general and the council. I am contact counsel to FSEC, as all of you. We can go to the next slide. This is not what I have as the next slide. Nope. It should say Oregon statewide planning goals. And it have, you want me to send it to you again, Nancy, or I don't know if Wally's with us.
Yes, Patrick. Chair Grow, can we take a quick break again and let me fix this issue?
Yes, we are going to take a pause and handle a technical issue. If everyone will please be patient. Thank you.
Thank you.
How is your land use standard? To issue a site certificate, council must find that a proposed facility complies with the statewide planning goals adopted by LCDC. So that's the basic framework. Next slide, please. So how can you go about finding compliance with the statewide goals? Applicants at the beginning of the process choose whether to demonstrate compliance with the goals by obtaining local government land use approval. That's what you see in the green box under sub A. Or they can come to council and they can say, council, we want you to find compliance with the statewide goals. If in most instances, since I've been involved, they ask you, council, to find compliance with the goals. The blue boxes, a lot of verbiage there. Those are the 3 different ways that you can find compliance with the goals. The top box says the proposed facility, if you find it, complies with the applicable substantive criteria from the affected local government's comprehensive plan. We go back, Deb, thank you. So you can find that the facility complies with applicable criteria from the acknowledged comp plan and land use regulations that are required by statewide goals, and with any LCDC rules and land use statutes that apply directly to the facility. You could also find that the facility does not comply with one or more applicable substantive criteria from the local jurisdiction, but otherwise complies with the goals, or an exception is justified. And last, you can find that the facility complies with the goals or an exception is justified. That seems redundant with what I just said. There are nuances in those last 2 parts that we don't have time to get into today, because really I want to focus this presentation on what you do when you are asked to grant an exception to a goal. We go to the next slide, please. Goal 3, this is probably the goal that you deal with most often, because a lot of the facilities are being proposed to be sited on agricultural land. The purpose of Goal 3 is to preserve and maintain agricultural lands for farm use. The goal requires counties to identify farmland, designate it as such on their comprehensive plan map, and zone it exclusive farm use. An EFU zone places restrictions on developments that are unrelated to agriculture in order to minimize uses that would conflict with farming. So LCDC has detailed rules addressing how agricultural lands may be used, including non-farm uses, And they'll allow non-farm uses on ag land if they won't have significant adverse effect on accepted farm practices. For example, next slide, please. LCDC has a rule that prohibits a solar PV facility from using, occupying, or covering more than 12 acres of high-value farmland, unless certain criteria are satisfied, which I'm not going to go into now, or the county or FSEC grants an exception to the goal. Next slide, please. Exceptions. So we see on the left, that is the statute that governs how local governments provide an exception. The statute on the right is the statute that governs how FSEC may provide an exception. That's the statutory language on the right is also mirrored in your land use standard. You might recall last month at our meeting when Hillary Foote provided the Farm and Forest report, she mentioned that FSEC's process for granting an exception is somewhat less stringent than the DLCD process that the counties follow. Again, that's the process on the left. She was referring to the language that I've highlighted in yellow in the statute, and I'll summarize that for you. Under the DLCD process, again, which local governments follow, it must be demonstrated that areas that don't require an exception, for example, lands other than EFU lands, that those lands cannot accommodate the proposed facility. And it must be demonstrated that, quote, environmental, economic, social, and energy consequences of using the proposed site are not significantly more adverse than those that would result from using an alternative site in other areas requiring a goal exception. Put simply, it means to get an exception under the DLCD process for counties, you must demonstrate that there aren't other locations you could site the facility that would have less of an impact on agricultural lands. That's known as an alternatives analysis. FSEC does not need to do an alternatives analysis. Doesn't address that in the statute, doesn't. So what you see in B and C, the language I've highlighted, that's not in the statute that governs your granting of exceptions. That's apparent not just from the statutory language, but it has been litigated in a Supreme Court case, which we'll turn to now. Next slide, please. This is a case that was brought against FSEC, 2005, as you can see. It was a rather large proposed natural gas facility in Klamath County. The Klamath County Land Development Code, implementing Goal 3, proposed that a commercial energy facility could use a maximum of 12 acres of high value land or 20 acres of non-high value land before the exception is required. In this instance, the proposed facility would have used 50.6 acres of land zoned EFU, so an exception was needed. FSEC granted a site certificate. They determined that an exception to Goal 3 was warranted. These are the reasons in that instance that council found an exception was warranted. They said the proposed facility, found that the proposed facility was at the confluence of 3 unique and essential resources. There was a stable groundwater well, an existing natural gas pipeline, and an existing electric transmission line and substation. Council found that the facility would support the existing transmission system, which was in critical need of more capacity, that it would benefit the local economy through employment opportunities and contributions to the local tax base, and that it would conserve farmland over the long run by concentrating electrical generation facilities into one larger compact facility rather than several smaller facilities. Petitioners challenged the council's findings. Petitioners asserted, among other arguments, that the council's order, quote, ignores the myriad of possibilities of alternative locations consistent with the statewide planning goals. Council and the developer argued that petitioners were seeking an alternatives analysis, which the statutes don't require council to do when council, rather than the local government, takes an exception to a land use planning goal. The Supreme Court agreed with council based on a comparison of the two statutes that we just reviewed. Next slide, please. This is a quote from the court's decision. A comparison of the two statutes makes clear that the legislature used the DLCD statute as the basis for the later enacted FSEC statute, but omitted the requirement of an alternatives analysis. We therefore conclude that the legislature did not intend to require council to perform an alternatives analysis in making a determination under your statute that an exception could be taken to a land use planning goal. In this case, petitioners also argued that there was not substantial evidence to support council's reasons for granting an exception, those reasons that I just recited to you. As we've discussed in prior meetings, there must be substantial evidence in the record to support the findings that you make. When the Supreme Court or an appellate court for other agencies is presented with an argument that there isn't substantial evidence, the court doesn't decide if they believe there was enough evidence. It asks, could a reasonable person have concluded that the evidence supported the finding? In this case, the court also rejected the argument that there wasn't substantial evidence to support the exceptions. Next slide, please. This is a quote from the decision in response to the substantial evidence argument. The court said the evidence also showed that the proximity of the site to an existing natural gas pipeline and to the major north-south transmission line on the West Coast, as well as a substation, made the site particularly suited for a gas-powered electricity generation facility. Other evidence showed that the facility needed a site of 50.6 acres. Each of the council's findings regarding the Goal 3 exceptions is supported by substantial evidence in the record. I'll take a moment here to remind you of examples of reasons that council has provided in recent site certificates for granting an exception to Goal 3. Locational dependency, you're familiar with that. That was one that was essentially argued in this case. For example, proximity to existing transmission or to other energy infrastructure or to major transportation corridors. Another reason that you have found for granting an exception is minimal direct impacts to agriculture within the proposed subject tracts, minimal indirect impacts to agriculture in the surrounding area, minimal impact to other resources protected by council standards, and economic benefit. With regard to economic benefit, I'll note that in recent years, council has moved more toward requiring a demonstration that there will be not just a general economic benefit, but an economic benefit to the agricultural community in particular. So what are the lessons that we take from the Save Our Rural Oregon case? First, council does not have to do an alternatives analysis when considering whether to grant an exception. And second, as always, make sure that your findings are supported by substantial evidence. Next slide, please. That brings us to the second case that we'll discuss, 1000 Friends of Oregon v. Jackson County. This is a more recent case, 2018. It addressed the LCDC rule that I mentioned earlier, prohibiting a solar PV facility from using more than 12 acres of high-value farmland unless certain criteria are satisfied or an exception was granted. In that instance, the developer proposed a PV facility that would require an exception. The Jackson County Board of Commissioners approved the application based on a reasons exception to Goal 3, including finding that there was a demonstrated need for the facility and local necessity. I will note that the county board also granted an exception based on a rural industrial development reason. I'm not going to go into that in any detail today, but I mention it because it was brought up in litigation, and it's also relevant to some pending legislation that I'll mention at the end of the presentation. In this case, the Court of Appeals, local government, as I'm sure many of you are already aware, goes through a far different appellate process than ours. You go to LUBA, then you go to the Court of Appeals. Your cases, decisions go directly to the Supreme Court. Ultimately here, the Court of Appeals concluded that the proposed facility did not fall within the definition of industrial development for the purposes of an exception. But again, I don't want to go down that because that analysis of that reason would take the entire presentation to discuss that. If we could go to the next slide, please. We'll go back to the demonstrated need reason. The county board found that a demonstrated need based on the requirements of statewide planning goal 13, energy conservation. That goal says land and uses developed on the land shall be managed and controlled so as to maximize the conservation of all forms of energy based upon sound economic principles. This is what the county board found, and then I'll try to make sure that we're all tracking. County board found goal 13 in the context of the policies set forth in the state's energy policy establishes a general requirement to utilize renewable resources, including the in-state siting of renewable energy production facilities such as that one that was being proposed. So in other words, the Jackson County Board of Commissioners found that goal 13, the stated purpose of which is to encourage the conservation of energy, justified taking an exception to goal 3, the conservation of agricultural lands. When Thousand Friends appealed that decision, first it goes to the Land Use Board of Appeals, to LUBA. LUBA rejected the county's analysis. We could go to the next slide. So here was the LUBA decision. It said they disagreed. Essentially, they said, well, development of renewable energy is certainly consistent with goal 13. Goal 13 doesn't include any express mandates regarding the development of renewable energy sources. The LUBA decision was then appealed. Appeals of LUBA decision go to the Oregon Court of Appeals. We go to the next slide, please. The Court of Appeals also found, similarly to LUBA, that the text of goal 13 did not require essentially the development, did not justify an exception to goal 3. It doesn't require that you develop renewable energy facilities. So try to sum this up to make sure that we're all tracking. The county, in this case, relied on goal 13's focus on conserving energy as a reason to grant an exception to goal 3 and the LCDC rule prohibiting a solar facility from occupying more than 12 acres. LUBA rejected that argument. The Court of Appeals rejected that rationale. They both concluded that goal 13 contains no requirements to utilize renewable energy or any requirements for how land is to be used, and does not justify granting an exception to goal 3. The lesson learned from this is goal 13 does not justify taking an exception to goal 3 or any other goals. Nevertheless, even though this decision came out in 2018, we have still seen some applicants cite to goal 13 and the conservation of energy as a reason why council should grant an exception to goal 3. When that argument has been presented, we have pointed to this decision when rejecting the argument. I mentioned earlier pending legislation. As of this morning, on the Oregon Legislative Information System website, this appeared to still be a live bill. There's essentially in HB 3409. It's an omnibus bill where they have combined many different bills that had been introduced before the walkout into one bill. Section 35 of that bill, it begins at section 35, is called the Finding Opportunities and Reducing Conflict in Siting Photovoltaic Solar Power Generation Facilities. And under that, the draft of the bill, it says that LCDC shall adopt rules to allow a local government to consider a PV solar power generation facility as a rural industrial use for purposes of justifying a reason for an exception. Now, you remember I mentioned earlier in the second case we discussed that it was found that the proposed facility was not a rural industrial use. So this legislation is essentially directly responding to that court decision and saying that LCDC shall adopt rules to allow a government to consider a solar PV facility as a rural industrial use for purposes of justifying an exception. It also says that the LCDC shall adopt rules establishing criteria through which local governments may be permitted or required to allow the siting of a PV solar power generation facility. So we obviously don't know if that will pass, but my read on that is that legislation in part is a direct response to the Thousand Friends decision. That is all I have. If you have questions or if there's anything you would like to discuss.
Madam Chair. Madam Chair.
Myself on mute. Thank you. Councilmember Devlin?
Yes, this may seem like kind of an esoteric question, but how would this apply to lands that were previously exempted from the ag and forestry goal? I remember that in the 1980s, when Metro began sort of the long-term planning for the region, there were an enormous amount of exception lands outside the urban growth boundary. There are fewer than that now because of the amount of expansion of the urban growth boundary. But how would this apply to lands that had already been exempted from the ag and forestry goals?
So you mean how would the requirements, the criteria for finding an exception, would you need to make an exception for lands that were already exempted?
Correct, because even those lands that were exempted under previous conditions, you know, if it was in some cases by the soil conditions, they would appear to be, you know, more prime agricultural lands, but they were exempted at the time when local governments had far more latitude to exempt lands from the ag and forestry goals.
So I would want to see the language that granted the exemption.
Okay.
I can speculate that it included a grandfather clause, which would have said you're good. Any legislation rules passed subsequent to this doesn't affect you. We're grandfathering you in, but I haven't seen that, so I couldn't tell you if that's the case.
Okay. And I know there are other restrictions in those areas, you know, beyond that for like solar development, particularly in the Willamette Valley. So.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments?
Madam Chair, Cindy Condon.
Yes, Councilmember Condon.
Just, I think this is an appropriate question. I'm just not as familiar as some of you are with the land use goals and regulations. Does water, we've heard, you know, several times about water, the inability to irrigate. Does water enter into the designation for exclusive farm use at all? And how often are the designations made? I mean, is there Does it change over time?
So I can speak to part of that, and then I would certainly open it up to council members Byer and Howell and Secretary Cornett, who have a wealth of experience in this arena. I mentioned earlier that the LCDC rule prohibiting a solar PV facility from using more than 12 acres unless there are certain criteria that are satisfied or an exception is granted. Among the criteria that would allow you to site a solar PV facility on more than 12 acres of high value farmland are considerations that are relevant to water. So for example, if the proposed facility is on high value farmland, but it is not within the boundaries of an irrigation district, or it is in place of use where there is not a water right permit, then the prohibition would not apply. There was a second part to your question, Councilmember Condon, that I didn't feel like I would be able to answer. Do you recall what that was?
Yeah, it's the designation of high value farmland, and does it change over time? I know it's based on soil type, but is it stagnant?
Yeah, I can't speak to that, but someone else might be able to address that.
So for the record, Todd Cornett. So Councilmember Condon, I can respond to that, and certainly would invite Vice Chair Howe and Councilmember Byer to add anything to that as well. I wouldn't say it's a static. So for, high value farmland has a statutory definition. It is in part based upon soils, and that's typically done by the Natural Resource Conservation Service. So there's online mapping that you can find. But many of those soils are also, it depends on if it has irrigation. So, if it's, this particular soil type and it doesn't have a water right or irrigation, then it may be, a class 2 or 3 soil. But if it has irrigation, it's a class 1 soil. So it's kind of static and kind of not at the same time. So you could basically have, a plot of land that has a water right and transfer that water right, and that would change then, the designation of that particular plot, because again, it has a different, value without the water, and then vice versa. So it's a little bit of a generalization, but it's kind of static and kind of not at the same time. Most soils, if you go into the areas where most of our facilities are proposed, it would be more like class 3, class 4 soils. It's a lot of winter wheat. They typically don't have water rights. They don't have irrigation. So those ones are pretty static. But other areas, again, whether it's on the east side of the Cascades or even in the Willamette Valley, there can be some variation based on access to water.
So just to follow up on that, so if there's no water right and someone is saying, I don't have water rights, I have grown on this before, but I can't now. There's no requirement that, okay, it's high value farmland. Can you grow dryland crops? There's not a requirement to show that you can't grow dryland crops economically that might preclude an exception.
I think it depends upon the circumstances of each property and location. And so, I don't think we can come to some sort of a general categorical determination. I think there's a lot of variation based upon each site. And that's, again, the very nature of a goal exception is it's sort of, there's an exceptional circumstances. There are and then typically, or at least all the ones that we see are reasons exception. It's not a built, a built or committed exceptions. It's a reasons exception. So they have to justify reasons of why this particular area should receive an exception, to the protection of goal 3. So it would, again, it would depend upon all of those circumstances, which is not just the physical ground at which it's proposed, but what are the potential implications on surrounding farm fields and then the larger agricultural production in the region. I think, last month, Hillary Foote from DLCD talked about this, that you could have an area and, maybe, a particular farm ground, wouldn't have a direct impact, but it could have a broader impact. Maybe it reduces a certain amount of agricultural production, which on its face doesn't seem that big of a deal, but that could be that sort of threshold, which then start to eliminate the economic, ability of packing houses and distributors and, John Deere, distributors and other companies that provide support to local agriculture. So there's a lot of complexity that goes into evaluating, any particular plot of land for a goal exception. And it's not just a series of check boxes to say we hit these check boxes and therefore, at least that's how our process works now. So it is very site specific and has been, and until there is some change, will continue to be.
Thank you.
And I'll just note that the last thing that Todd described would fall under the umbrella of minimal indirect impacts to agriculture in the area, which is one of the reasons that you have found in the past for granting an exception.
Chair Grail?
Yes, Councilmember Byer.
So I would just echo what Todd has said on the EFU, the farmland designations are primarily driven by soil type, and then the soil type, when we look at the data from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, generally has two categories. If irrigated, this value; if not irrigated, the lower value soil. Generally, what we have done at the county level is said, if you don't have water rights now and you aren't served by an irrigation district, the likelihood of in the future of that changing to provide irrigation water in this drier environment is pretty unlikely. And you could make that finding that if no water today, no groundwater, no water resources permit, no irrigation district service, probably not going to be irrigated. I'm going to channel Hanley for a bit. When we look at the LCDC rules, we talk about arable land, which is, can you crop it? But there's a whole nother realm of agricultural use, cattle raising, those kinds of things that can also happen on farm ground that need to be considered when we look at farming impacts. I think Todd and Patrick are absolutely correct in looking at those indirect impacts. If we put in these facilities, do they in any way impact area farmers from being able to produce their crops? We often look at the right to farm legislation. If my neighbor cropped us, what does that do to my solar panels and vice versa? So that kind of consideration also goes into these findings. And I think what Patrick mentioned, when we look at mitigating the impacts to agriculture from any of the energy facilities, can we tie the mitigation to economic impacts to agriculture? And I think one of the recent cases we looked at, one of the recent site certificates we looked at, had a very specific consideration for economic impacts to agriculture. So that was a bit of a ramble, but as Todd said, each of these cases is going to be so site specific, and ensuring that we as a council make findings relative to that particular site in the context of that local agricultural production area. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions for Patrick? Patrick, I would just like to say, I've said it probably every meeting for a really long time. The land use is something that is just new to me, except looking at it from, a utility perspective, I guess. And your synopsis makes sense to me, and you've been educating us very clearly over the last couple of years about how important it is for us to have the dialogue so our conclusions are clear. And as you discussed this today, it just reiterated that point. So I appreciate these segments that you've been providing. It's very helpful for me personally in evaluating our role here.
Oh, thank you. It's helpful for me too. It kind of sharpens the knife when I have to just prepare the presentations.
Wonderful. Well, if you don't have any additional remarks, then we will go on to the next agenda item.
No, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Our next agenda item is the Summit Ridge Wind Farm Financial Institution List request. This is an action item, and we have Todd Cornett, Assistant Director for Siting and our Council Secretary, presenting to us today. Way to switch hats, Todd. Here you go.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the request essentially that we have is for the Summit Ridge Wind Farm, which is an existing approved facility with a site certificate that has requested to add 2 institutions to the council's list of institutions, that council can rely upon that have, the sort of financial viability to provide bonds or letters of credit. Just to go backward a little bit in time, or more broadly, the way our process works, and this is not any kind of statute or rule, this is just how we've done it for some time, is that on an annual basis, we, the staff, will provide you an overview of the facilities that are on the already pre-approved council's financial institution list. We will do an assessment of those and basically tell you whether they still are, good financially viable institutions that you, council, can rely upon to issue bonds and letters of credit to the certificate holders. So we do that on an annual basis. But that doesn't preclude a certificate holder requesting to add new financial institutions to the list. We had one last month that was approved and added to the list. And this certificate holder has requested to add 2 institutions to the list, which we have looked at. And I will indicate that Mr. David Skidmore is on the webinar. David is the internal auditor for the Oregon Department of Energy. David also has some background, which is particularly helpful in evaluating these banking institutions. You've seen the staff reports. The work was all done by David. So I'm just sort of reiterating his analysis, inclusion, and conclusions. Should you have specific questions, I would probably defer to David because he's the expert in here, and I'm just essentially summarizing what he's already concluded. Before I jump into these specific ones, I will also indicate, we've had a lot of conversations about bonds and letters of credit. Do we have the right template language? Can we rely on these institutions? How does this work? I've had a conversation with David and asked him to look at reevaluating how we do this on an annual basis in terms of how do we look at these institutions? Should we be looking at them on an annual basis, twice a year? Should there be any issues? And Councilmember Condon and I had a recent conversation about this, and there's been a lot of, we'll say, interest going on recently in the banking industry. Should something come up with a particular bank, should that trigger us to reevaluate the list outside of those sort of preset timeframes? So we're going to be looking at those protocols for reviewing these, and we'll be coming back to council in the next several months at some point with a recommendation of is what we're doing now fine, or should we make changes? And we'll be requesting your input on that. So now to the actual request at hand. So the Summit Ridge certificate holder has requested to add 2 financial institutions, Banco Santander, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and KeyBank. And again, I will just point to the fact that, you have a good staff report with pretty significant analysis on each one of these financial institutions based on recent information. And the conclusion was that the first one, Banco Santander, is actually a viable and stable banking institution, and that we would recommend you add that to the pre-approved financial assurance list. But the Key Bank is not, based upon some recent issues, and you can see on the slide the major credit rating institutions. Two of them have the long-term outlook as negative, one as stable. As a result of that, David has included in his staff report, and we, within the citing division, agree that we don't believe that this particular bank should be added to the pre-approved list. I'll go back to the whole point of bonds and letters of credit. The way that our process works is there's a condition that requires at the end of the life of the facility or when it ceases operation, that the certificate holder has the responsibility to decommission the facility and return the site to a pre-existing or at least a useful non-hazardous situation. That's the main plan. That's the requirement. Should something go wrong, whatever that may be, this is the backup plan. The backup plan is that we, the state of Oregon, will go in and decommission the facility and return it to a useful non-hazardous state. So from my perspective, this backup plan has to be unquestionable that it is allowable, which is why we appreciate all the conversations we've had on the template language for the bonds and letters of credit. Questions about how we do the sort of financial institutions and the bonds to make sure that there is no question that should something go terribly, terribly wrong, that we have everything that we need to return these sites to a useful non-hazardous situation. So any potential issue, I think we, at least the department, are going to take a very conservative approach in terms of our recommendations to the council. So based upon this long-term outlook on Key Bank, that provides some pause from us. And so our recommendation is to not add that to the pre-approved list. So Nancy, we can change the slide. So as you can see on this, you have the very top of the left-hand column, you have the Banco Santander as being proposed. It's in italics to be added to the list. The remainder are ones that are already pre-approved. We are not proposing, again, to add Key Bank. And so next slide, please. So here are your options is, as we've recommended, to add the first bank, but not the second bank. That is our recommendation. Second, you do have options. You could disagree with us, and that would be fine. You could add both banks to the pre-approved list. Or option three, you could add, not add either bank to the pre-approved list if you have any concerns about the first bank as well. So with that, I think last slide is council deliberation. That really concludes all the things that I wanted to bring up. And again, I would be happy to entertain any questions with the recognitions that I would probably defer those to David, because I do not have the same expertise that he has on this issue.
Thank you, Secretary Cornett. I would just like to say, for the record, this is Marcy. Councilmember Condon, your comments and questions over the last few meetings has made me more aware, and I've actually paid better attention to financial things lately, to the point where my own brother's annoyed that I keep asking questions since he works in banking. So thank you for helping me get more educated. I know Cicely addressed some concerns we had. So I just want to tell you that I feel better prepared to understand what we're looking at than I did previously from your contribution in this arena. So that's all I had to say. If anyone else has any questions or comments.
Madam Chair.
It looks
Yes.
like David has his hand raised. So David, if you'd like to make a comment or engage in the conversation, I've unmuted your mic.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Again, David Skidmore. But just briefly, my background, I have over 30 years of commercial banking, audit, and risk experience. So I've worked with multi-billion dollar banks. Part of my work is involved looking at internal controls and risk frameworks for different companies and also evaluating the risk posture of public companies. And so what I wanted to just also say is I'm open to ask to entertain any questions you might have on the analysis. A couple of general comments I'll make is that the rating agencies are sort of the gold standard, as it were, for third-party businesses to make a judgment as to whether a given entity, company is healthy financially to invest money in. And so these ratings are viewed pretty seriously by a lot of companies in the economy and the ecosystem, and they carry a lot of weight. Those ratings go through a spectrum of grading, like from the highest rating, very solid, and go through various shades of gray on those, to not so solid. So the ratings are divided in two sections, really, two components. Is the rating of the company now or as a given point in time, and then the second part of it is the outlook for that rating to go down, stay stable, or go up. In other words, for it to go up, remain the same, and go down. And so there's a lot of volatility in the banking industry right now. A lot of it has to do with the rate environment. The rate environment has a big impact on banks' ability to manage their assets and also to make money. And so making money is a key component of capital for companies, and it also plays a role in the credit rating process. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And again, I'm here to answer any questions that the council may have with regard to either bank, particularly KeyBank. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Marcy is having an issue with her volume. Kent, are you able to take over for her?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Councilor Devlin, go ahead.
Yes, are people ready for a motion?
I think we are.
Okay,
I had a quick question.
okay,
That might be okay after we have a motion and second. I don't know.
okay. I, Mr. Chairman, I move the staff recommendation. I feel relatively comfortable with it. And if I could comment, I did some of my own independent research on the institution I was not familiar with, which is the staff recommendation, and it seems very stable, to be honest.
Chair Grail, I don't know if you can hear me. I second. Well, okay, so we've had a second. We've got a motion and a second. So Councilor Condon, did you have some discussion?
Yes, really more a question, I suppose. I was just curious, and I do support the motion, but I was curious if, and I think I asked this at the last meeting, if the previously approved financial institutions, if a check's been made on their ratings, is similar to what we see here, and I was just curious if we don't approve KeyBank, would they be able to say, well, we have similar ratings to anybody else on the list? And so just curious if there's a comparison.
So I can respond to that. So for the record, Todd Cornett. We did not sort of take this opportunity to go back and look at all the other pre-approved institutions. So if we did get a response saying, hey, you know, KeyBank is exactly the same as something on the pre-approved list, then we would take that opportunity to probably go back and look at that other bank, and then we might come back with a recommendation to council to remove one of those, you know, that particular bank from the pre-approved list. And then we would then reach out to the certificate holder, or if any of the certificate holders had a bond or letter of credit with that institution, and say you need to change that.
Okay, thank you.
But
And just really,
I'll go back to one of the previous things that I said is I think this is an opportunity for us, particularly with the volatility in the banking industry, to reevaluate what are our protocols for doing these evaluations. Again, is it annually? You know, is it twice a year? What are our triggers to evaluate these? And I think that is, you know, that is something that we are going to be doing here pretty soon and coming with a recommendation to council. So, you know, we certainly don't want to be in a situation where you know, the banking industry is in all kinds of, you know, volatility, and we're not taking an opportunity to kind of reevaluate these institutions that are on the pre-approved list, which then may put us in a bad situation later on.
right, and I understand that. I was more concerned just with I don't know how many financial institutions we have not approved, but I think this is the first one I've seen, and just what that response might be if it's comparable to another institution on the list. So thank you for that.
And I did get a text from Chair Grell. I think she is back. Can you confirm, Chair Grell?
Yes, I am. That was so strange. Okay, I apologize. I'm not sure. I could see that people were speaking, but I could no longer hear. So I logged off and returned. So my apologies.
So Chair Grail, I'll turn it back over to you. We've had a motion that Councilor Devlin made, and I made a second to it. And the motion is to support the staff recommendation. I don't know whether there's needed to be two separate motions here, one to add Banco Santander and another one to not add KeyBank. I don't know if you need an affirmative not adding KeyBank or not. So anyway, if
Thank you.
So sorry, Madam Chair, I do have two motions kind of to that effect, but that doesn't mean you could make, I mean, I believe that Councilmember Devlin's motion was the staff recommendation was really the combination of those two. So that was my understanding, and I'll certainly make that change to the motion language as it goes into the minutes, unless council members want to change that.
Madam Chair,
So,
I'm comfortable with the motion that was made.
thank you. Councilmember Devlin's comfortable. Vice Chair House, since you provided the second, are you comfortable still?
yes, I am.
Okay, well, it sounded like there's already been plenty of deliberation. Are we ready to call the roll? Secretary Cornett, please call the roll.
Perry Chalktooth,
Yes.
Ann Byer,
Yes.
Cindy Condon,
Yes.
Richard Devlin,
Yes.
Marcy Grail,
Yes.
Kent Howe,
Yes.
Jordan Truitt.
Yes.
Motion carries, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Skidmore, thank you. We look forward to working with you in the future. Cicely's been a great asset to helping us, and we look forward to working with you as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. The next and final agenda item is the Muddy Creek Energy Project Appointment of Special Advisory Group. This is an action item. Again, we have Todd Cornett, Assistant Director for Siting and Council Secretary, to present. Todd?
Thank you, Madam Chair. During the last council meeting, I did mention this. I think it was during Hillary Foot's presentation, or as public comment, I don't recall, but there was some comment about the lack of large-scale solar projects in the Willamette Valley, and I had to mention that at that point we did have a notice of intent submitted. We just had not had a chance to review it fully to make sure that it had everything that was needed. Subsequent to the June 1st meeting, that has been done. Everything that is required in a notice of intent was included, and so we do have this notice of intent, which is effectively live now. So I will get into the details. So the notice of intent was submitted on May 19th of this year, and the application is for the Muddy Creek Energy Park. Thank you for advancing the slide, Nancy. As you are aware, the submission of the notice of intent is the very first step in the process for obtaining a site certificate. The applicant is the Muddy Creek Energy Park LLC. They are a wholly owned subsidiary of Hanwha Qcells Use Corp. And in the next couple of slides, I'll go over the details of the project and the location. But because the facility is greater than 12 acres, the project location is on high-value farmland. It is in high-value soils, going back to one of the prior presentations. The threshold for FSEC jurisdiction is met, and so that is why it is within the jurisdiction of the Energy Facility Siting Council. Nancy, you can advance the slide. Thank you. So this gives you kind of a laundry list of the description of the facility. So kind of the main description is that it's a 199 megawatt facility, solar PV solar generation. It would be located entirely within unincorporated Lynn County and entirely within the county's exclusive farm use zone. Therefore, a goal exception to goal 3 will be required. Again, going back to Patrick's presentation, we'll have a lot of different conversations because of the type of farm use and the location of this project, but it will have to go through the goal exception process. So you can see in the secondary list, the related and supporting facilities. It's typical of what we have seen with other solar projects. It would include, the battery storage system as an option, and the system would include 12 feet by 36 feet by 10 feet tall enclosures, and that would be located sort of in the center of the project. It would include a fairly short 230 kV gen tie line, and I'll show another slide which shows the location of the project, and it'll make more sense about why that's so short. Inverters and transformers, a collector substation, 34.5 kV collector lines, a 7-foot tall perimeter fence, and you can see 1,588 acres or 2.5 square miles, so a full perimeter fence surrounding that site, and then in service roads, probably around the perimeter of the project as well as throughout the internal site as well. Next slide, please. So this is a zoomed out version. You can see the blue line running down the middle of the slide is Interstate 5. So you can see the black lines kind of in the center is the project location. This would be the site boundary. And so you can see that it's immediately adjacent to Interstate 5. And at the very bottom of the slide, you can see how the lines of I-5 start to jar a little bit. And really just off of the slide is Eugene and Springfield. So it's just really north of Eugene, Springfield. You can see to the west, I don't know how well you can see the slide, but you have Junction City and Coburg. And then to the north of the site on the east side of the highway is Brownsville. So this gives you a sort of a bigger sense of where it is. So it's right there, just north of Eugene and Springfield, right along I-5. So next slide. This is more of a zoomed in map. Again, you can see I-5 is a little more to the left of the slide. You can see the black lines are the project boundary. And then the green line that kind of runs through it is an existing 230 kV Pacific Core transmission line. So that's what I would assume the reason why they're proposing the project in this location. The green hollow square, it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see the purple line that stands out a little bit more. Just to the very top of that purple line is a green hollow square. Thank you. That is the existing substation. Yeah, that's the existing Pacific Core Diamond Hill substation. This is why, the purple line would be the Gentai line. That's why it's a very short Gentai line. The project surrounds where it would interconnect with the grid. So again, probably the main reason why they're proposing this is it would be very or relatively inexpensive to connect it to the grid based on its proximal location to the transmission line and the substation. The yellow square, you can kind of see at the bottom of the purple line, that would be the collector substation for the facility. And then the solid green square would be a 10-acre centralized battery storage area. So that would be where the battery energy storage system, and I talked about the sort of the configurations or the diameters of the container units, that would hold the batteries. That's where they would all be located, is in there. So it gives you a sense of where the project is located and the facilities associated with the project. Are there any questions about the configuration?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Yes, Councilmember Devlin.
This is not to state anything for the record about the council's ultimate decisions relative to this, but if I've got the area correctly and I'm looking at it on other maps, it appears that there's one area that is set aside for wetlands preserve that might be close to the area, but it appears almost all of the rest of the area is in active cultivation. And I don't know if that's for grass seed, given where it's at, or if it's something else, but it all appears to be, or much of it appears to be in active cultivation.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Devlin. I believe that is the case. So when we received the notice of intent, the purpose of the notice of intent is that it's a fairly generalized overview of what the project is, who's proposing it, where it is. So at this point, we do not have all of those details in the record. My understanding, though, is you are correct. I believe if not the entirety of the facility, then certainly the most of it is in grass seed production. Just in that area, typically in Lynn County, there's a lot of grass seed production in that area, and I believe this is that as well. We will certainly know more about that as we proceed further into the review process, and all that information will be required to be in the application once it's submitted. But again, I believe you are correct.
Thank you.
I don't have this on any of the slides, but I will make note, since we are just working on it right now, trying to get the notice out. Again, we determined that everything that's required to be in the notice of intent is in the notice of intent, and we are working, particularly Chase McVeigh Walker is working on the notices, and so we intend to have a public notice sent out on Tuesday or Wednesday. So this would be the adjacent property owner notice, the email notification, and then likely Thursday of next week, we'll have the newspaper notice out. So that will alert people, if they're not already alerted, to the project, that we received the notice of intent, and that we are going to be holding a public information meeting in the city of Brownsville at City Hall, and I believe that is on July 25th. That would be in the evening, starting at 5. But we'll confirm all those details. Those will be in the notice, and we will send that notice out to the council as well. So you'll see that early next week. Next slide, please. I know we've done this several times, but it's probably a good opportunity.
Todd,
Yes.
this is Cindy. Sorry to interrupt. Before you go on, can you go back to the previous slide just for a second? So, are the enclosed black areas, are those separate tax lots or property owners? Do you know how many property owners are involved?
I do not recall. I'm sure that's in the notice of intent. Just based upon the acreage, I would imagine there are multiple tax lots. Even if it's all under one ownership, which I believe it is, but I would need to confirm that. I would think that there are certainly multiple tax lots that it would be located on.
Okay, and I was just curious if the tax lots are represented here by the line. We've got not just a boundary, but there are internal. I was just wondering if those were designating.
Well, the boundary lines probably, well, I can't confirm that. Sometimes, the property or the project boundary lines do follow tax lot lines, but sometimes they follow farm fields. So it could be,
Okay.
the property owner, has different farming on the same tax lot, one, a good valuable farm field and maybe one a less valuable farm field. So I've not done enough look at the details of the project to be able to confirm one way or another. But we will have that information moving forward. So unfortunately, I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer to your question.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks.
So going back to the steps in our process, so this slide shows the major steps in our process, and then those are the top row, the chevrons, going from the notice of intent all the way through the council's decision. The second row would be the main driver of that phase, and then the next two boxes are really the sort of participation opportunities and who participates in it. So you can see that the first box, the notice of intent, that's where we're at right now, and that's surrounded by the yellow box. The applicant is the main driver. They submitted their notice of intent. This includes a public notice, which again I indicated we are working on right now. There will be a public comment period. That'll be in the range of 45 days between when we send the notice out and then when the public comment period won't conclude at the public information meeting. It will go past that. And then there's also agency coordination. So we will be getting out memos very soon to the local government. I've been in communication with the local county planning director already. And this is what we're doing today is appointing them to be a special advisory group. That is really the purpose of this agenda item, not just an overview of the project. But then we'll also be sending memos out to state agencies and tribal governments that are identified in this process as well. And just a reminder that they submitted the notice of intent the latter part of last month, and the notice of intent is good for 2 years. So they will have 2 years within which to submit their preliminary application. If they fail to do that, the notice of intent will expire and they'll have to resubmit a notice of intent. And then also the timing trigger from that date in May when they submitted the notice of intent is the next phase, the project order, which is the list of standards and requirements that has to be submitted in the application. We, the department, you can see we're the driver of that one. We have 140 days to issue the project order. And so we have to sequence getting the notice out, holding the public information meeting, sending out memos to all of the state agencies, local governments, tribal governments, getting comments back from them in order to inform us on what should be included in the project order. And again, we have 140 days. Next slide, please. So going back to the land use review, Patrick talked about this on one of his slides. And, if you remember the diagram, talked about sort of the two paths, whether there's the local land use path or the FSEC path. So the applicant, until they submit their preliminary application, has the ability to choose who's going to do the land use review. They can choose the local government to do the land use review, or they can choose FSEC to do that review. In the notice of intent, the applicant has indicated that they are going to be seeking FSEC to conduct the land use review as part of its consolidated review. And again, I've had that conversation with the local government, Lynn County as well, so they're aware of that. The applicant can change their mind prior to the preliminary application and choose the local land use path. So we'll still see whether they continue to want to do that. But as a result of them choosing the Energy Facility Siting Council to conduct a land use review, the Lynn County Board of County Commissioners must be appointed as a special advisory group. That's a statutory mandate. Next slide, please. So what that means for Lynn County is today, really there's no other opportunity. That's why you'll see that there's really the staff's recommendation is a single recommendation and council's options are really one option. You don't have the ability to not appoint them as a special advisory group because that's a mandate in statute. I've already sent them a letter, had a couple phone calls, but I already sent them a letter giving them a heads up that that would be occurring during this council meeting and what their role is as a special advisory group. We'll be sending them a follow-up letter after this. But just to reiterate, what is their role as a special advisory group? So at the notice of intent stage, we're going to be seeking any issues of concern. It's their knowledge of the project location is certainly going to be a lot better than ours, and we want to know what issues of concern they have. If they were going to be conducting the review, what would their land use criteria be? Do they have any directly applicable comprehensive plan provisions? So that would be the applicable substantive criteria. Are there any data or studies that needed to be done or evaluated to determine compliance with the land use standards? What are their necessary permits? And then do they have any thoughts or ideas on the analysis area? So I don't have a particular slide. We do usually when we have the public information meeting is in the notice of intent dictates study area distances based upon certain issues or standards. So whether it's the site boundary or going out a half mile or 5 miles or 20 miles, under the notice of intent, the applicant is required to do desktop studies consistent with those study area distances. So those same issues and standards have analysis area distances in the application. They typically are the same as the study area distances, but they don't have to be. They can be greater, they can be lesser than those study area distances. And so when we're seeking input from the public, from reviewing agencies, we want to know, do you have any concerns? If it's a half-mile study area, is there something at 3/4 of a mile that you think is really significant, and therefore we should establish the analysis area at 3/4 of a mile versus a half a mile, for example. So that's why the analysis area is listed in, or analysis areas are listed in some of the information that we're seeking from them. And then throughout the process during completeness review, once we get that application or that preliminary application, we are going to seek the Lynn County's review of that to determine, did they submit everything that's needed for us to review and make findings? And then once we issue completeness, we again go back to them and try to figure out, do they have any issues of concern? If they were going to put in conditions based upon their review, what would those conditions be? That helps inform us as staff in making the findings, the recommended findings and conditions that we put in the draft proposed order. Next slide, please. So that concludes really the overview of the project, the role of the special advisory group. And so our recommendation as staff, consistent with the statute, is to appoint the Lynn County Board of Commissioners as the special advisory group for any proceedings related to this project. So this would not just be the application, it would be any subsequent amendments to the application or the approved site certificate should council ultimately approve the site certificate in the future. Next slide, please. So with that, I will turn it over to council. Happy to take any questions that you have. If not, you have, again, one motion really is your limitation on that.
Thank you. Council members, are there any questions or comments regarding this issue?
Madam Chair, this is Kent.
Yes, Vice Chair Howe.
I move the council appoint the Lynn County Board of Commissioners as special advisory group for council proceedings related to the proposed Meddy Creek Energy Project.
Thank you, sir.
Madam Chair, Cindy Condon, I second.
Thank you, Councilmember Condon. I'll ask again if there are any questions or comments about this appointment of a special advisory group. Thank you. Hearing none. Mr. Secretary, please call the roll.
Richard Devlin,
Aye.
Perry Chalktoot,
Yes.
Kent Howe,
Yes.
Ann Byer,
Yes.
Marcy Grail,
Yes.
Jordan Truitt,
Yes.
Cindy Condon.
Yes.
Motion carries, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Well, we have worked our way through our agenda. So I would ask council members if anyone has any final comments or thoughts that they are inclined to share.
Madam Chair, just again reiterate the July council meeting, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, the Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we've made those changes. So again, I would encourage everybody to make known your participation either in person or virtually to Nancy so we can make sure that we're planning accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank staff for their diligent work as always in preparing the information necessary for this meeting. And thank you to the council members for your time and effort today. The time is now 11:25 and the June 23rd, 2023 meeting of the Energy Facility Siting Council is now adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.